Okay, today I'm going to show you how to create more detail in the highlight area and more detail in the shadow area. Since we live in a very sunny area, we have a lot of that. We have very strong shadows and very strong highlights. Sometimes we need to kind of even them out a little bit. Okay? But one thing that happens is that it's a very strange thing about Adobe Photoshop is we cannot create a layer that says shadows and highlights in Adobe Photoshop. For some reason, even in the newer upgrades, they haven't done it. So we have to do something a little bit different. So the first thing we want to do is we want to duplicate our background. There are two ways to do that. One is I can just right-click and go to Duplicate Layer. Then it allows me to name it. So I'm going to name it Shadows and Highlights. Okay? Now you see that that layer says Shadows and Highlights. It's the exact same as my background layer, but it says that. I can also use Control-J for a duplicate layer. Control-J. Whenever possible, I'm going to tell you about keystrokes, so it'll make your work a little bit quicker in your workspace. Okay? Control-J is the same as right-clicking and going to Duplicate Layer. So when I'm on that layer now, I need to convert it to a smart object. Okay? In order to do that, I'm going to go to Layer, go down to where it says, where is it? Or, actually, Image. Oh, there it is, Smart Object, right in the middle. Sorry. And you're going to go to Convert to Smart Object on that layer that you created for shadows and highlights. So once I've done that, in the little corner, there's like a little symbol there that looks like a paper and something else in there. But that tells you it's a smart object. So when I'm on this layer now, I'm going to go over to Image, Adjustments, and then you'll see this menu pop up. This menu is almost the same menu that pops up when you use your adjustment layers in Photoshop. You know that little yin-yang symbol that you said you can go in and create adjustment layers? But you'll notice that in here there is no shadows and highlights. So we can't create our own layer there. So we're going to come back over here to Image, Adjustments, and we're going to go to Shadows and Highlights. Image, Adjustments, Shadows and Highlights. Okay, once we've done that, we have what will first pop up is this kind of menu with two sliders, shadows and the highlights. We're going to use more options in a minute, but right now you'll see that that's what pops up. The default when you click on it always is to lighten the shadows 35%. Okay? We want to go back to what our image started with, so we move that slider all the way to the left. That's where our image started. That shows you before you've done anything. So if we move it to the right, we're going to lighten up the shadows. Now, I would say never go over 35%. It almost always looks entirely fake if you do that. One of the things about using shadows and highlights, it's very easy to screw up and go too far. So I'm going to try to show you how not to do that today. So we're going to go all the way to there. Now, there's shadow areas here, but they're not really, really dark. The main issue we have in this picture are the highlights, right? There's no detail. Even though we see that there's stuff here, there's not a lot of detail in there. So we want to create more detail. And one thing we want to do is use this so we are using the full menu here, because we have some options that we can change on here. Let's move this over a little. So first thing we want to do is keep the shadows where they are. If I lighten them, I don't think it needs to be lightened. And if you go too far, you can make it look awful. And a lot of people use this too far. So we're going to go to the highlight slider, and we're going to go and darken down those back there. Now you start to see how much you see the clouds back here, how you start to see the horizon back here, where you didn't see any of that before. Okay, because now we're bringing detail into that. But it also starts to look a little bit flat. And if we go too far, I want to show you what happens. We can always tell when we've gone too far by what we call the halo effect around our images. So if you look around here, you start to see a halo effect around all of this. That shows you when shadows and highlights has gone too far. It's a real common way to know when we've gone too far. So we're going to come back in. Whoops. Let's go up a bit. We want to come back in and move that so we just are darkening it enough. Here's the preview on and off to get detail in there without losing or creating that halo effect. We also can change our tone and radius. Like right now it's a little flat. So if I move this up a little, I can create a little more contrast and make it look a little bit more natural. Okay, and just play little tiny increments on these sliders are what are going to make all the difference in the world. So if we click the before and the after, there's a huge difference in that picture, right? You can really see a whole bunch of detail in that background that wasn't there before by clicking that on and off. So I'm going to say OK for that. Now what happens when it made this filter into a smart object is that now we can come back to it. Just like we can come back to an adjustment layer, on this one we have the ability to do that. If we come back here and double click on shadows and highlights, that whole menu pops up again and allows us to do the changes again, which is really, really cool. Okay? So that's why we want to create a smart object out of it. We can also turn it on and off by the eye on the layer, so the viewing mode of it, we can see it or not see it. But now you see, we see the clouds back here, we see the horizon, we see the little mountain back here. Very, very different than what it started with. And we got a lot more details. Now when we go to save it, File, Save As, what are we going to save it as? TIFF, how come? We want these layers to stay there so we can go back and adjust them anytime we want, right? So now when I go into that folder, I'm going to have in there two of those pictures. One before and one with the changes that we made. Okay, so let's do another one. Very common in our area, a picture with rocks and sand and the ocean. So we see that we have no detail in the shadow here at all. None. Really, really dark. Hardly any detail in the highlight area. So what's the first thing I do? I'm going to duplicate the background. So I'm going to do Control J. If I do Control J, it doesn't allow me to change the name unless I click on here. Double click and I can now change the name. So I have that layer there. Now I need to do what to that layer? Convert it to a smart object. So I'm going to go to Layer and I'm going to go down to Smart Object and Convert to Smart Object. Okay? Once I've done that, I'm going to go into Image, Adjustments, Shadows and Highlights again. Okay, let's move this over so we can see it better. Let me cancel so I can move this over a little. Image, Adjustments, Shadows and Highlights. So again, the default instantly went to 35% to lighten up the shadow area. That's a little bit too much, I think, in this one. So we're going to kind of come over a little and go down. I want detail in the shadow areas, but I still want them to look like shadows. If you go way above it, it starts to look totally fake, right? Nothing like a shadow. So we want to keep the idea that there are shadows there, but we just want to lighten them up to be able to see some detail in them. So there's the before and after with the shadow areas. So now we also have lots of detail in the highlights on top of the rock, in the water, and in the sand. So I'm going to take the highlight slider and I'm going to move that to get some detail there. Now it went a bit flat. So again, I'm going to use these little, the radius and tone sliders to try to get a little bit more detail in there and a little bit more contrast. So if I click those on and off, you can see what a difference we made in that picture, right? And maybe I need to move this and get a little bit more contrast there too. So you kind of play little increments to make sure it looks good. So now I have that there, and you see that it said Smart Filters, Shadow and Highlights. If I want to go back in and change it and make it a little bit darker back there, I can just click on that, open it up, and I can darken that down a little bit. Because I still have my last adjustments on there. I have the ability to do that. So then I'm going to go to Save It. File, Save As, and we're always going to save it as a TIFF because we want the layers in there. We say OK, and that's what we do. But it really makes a difference in our picture. So if we go back and we look at our original compared to our changed one, you can really see the difference in those two images. So we have some detail in the shadow areas, a whole lot more detail in the rock that we couldn't hardly see here at all. We now get in this picture really well. Okay, so that's what using smart objects on an adjustment layer are.